So this lesson is on Puritan and colonial literature, and this is background for our unit of readings on the Puritan and colonial period in American literature. I want to start with the Protestant Reformation, right? Because the Puritans come out of this Protestant period, and you should remember some of this from your world history courses over the last couple of years. But the Reformation starts with this major rupture in European Christianity. Starts in 1517 with Martin Luther, moves on to John Calvin in 1530, and finally Henry VIII in 1534. These are the major ruptures. I mean, the Protestant period and the Reformation would go on for at least another century, depending on how you date it. But overall, it's this shattering of Christendom, right? Because as you know, I mean, pretty much from the end of the Roman Empire until the Protestant Reformation, there's really only one kind of Christianity in Europe, and that's Catholicism. And the popes and the bishops had tremendous power over Europe. Obviously for spiritual reasons and the potential to excommunicate people, which meant they'd be sent to hell forever. But also, the popes and the bishops had a lot of economic power and just day-to-day influence over people. And, in the Dark Ages and even the early medieval period, it's really the church that holds Europe together. So when the Reformation hits and Europe starts breaking into all these different religious communities, this is a very scary, violent time. And you can see on the map here at the bottom, right, the green is Catholicism, the pink and purple are Lutheranism and Calvinism, and the light blue is Anglicanism. And then you've got this other small group, these Bohemian and Moravian Christians. And so you can see some of the areas, too, where the religions are very mixed. And anywhere there's mixing of those colors, there's a lot of a lot of friction, a lot of violence, very often people being burned alive or hung or executed for holding on to Catholicism and not converting to Protestantism, or the other way around, trying to introduce Protestantism and, the Catholic authorities have them killed. So, this is a very violent and volatile time. And I want you to appreciate that, because that's going to explain part of why the Puritans are the way they are, why their literature is the way it is. You keep in mind this background of violence and also just individuality, right? I mean, the Protestants and the Puritans were a group of Protestants, really had an increased emphasis on personal conscience, less of an emphasis on obedience towards authority, more emphasis on a personal reading of the Bible as opposed to, again, listening to priests and bishops and their authority in reading the Bible. Also, a big emphasis on congregational autonomy, which means every small local church is kind of on its own and can do whatever it wants. They're not aligned with, the big church in Rome or the big church in London, if we're going to talk about the Anglicans, which I'm going to get to in a moment. It was very much more individualized and localized. And so you've got all these different groups bumping up against each other. And like I said, it was a very violent and volatile time. Now, the Puritans, who we're going to study, who colonized North America, they came from England, right? So we want to really zero in here on England. And that Henry VIII's break from the Catholic Church was very much about dynastic succession, right? He needed to have a son to carry on the bloodline and rule the throne. And this shows the connection between church and state in European history at this time period, specifically in England, but it was this way across the continent. And so when he breaks with the Catholic Church, he starts the Anglican Church, or the Church of England, which is, pretty close to a theocracy in that the king has tremendous influence over the church, as opposed to, the Catholic Church, where the Pope in Rome really has more influence over the European king, as it were. And this led to a series of back and forths that were bloody and messy and scary, right? Henry VIII's daughter by his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, she's known as so-called Bloody Mary because of all the violent things she did to try to push England back into Catholicism. After she dies and the death of her younger half-brother, Edward, then her half-sister, Elizabeth I, takes over. She brings England firmly back into Protestantism, and Anglicanism is what it is. And, there's a little bit of violence there, as well as literally the Catholics on the continent sending like sleeper cells in and agitators and this kind of propaganda war against Elizabeth's rule, because of course she's a bastard. She's not the child of the first marriage, and so to Catholics she's not the true ruler. And so you've got the church trying to undermine her authority. Her cousin, distant cousin Charles I, who later became king, he was reputed to be a Catholic sympathizer, maybe even a so-called closet Catholic. This is one of the factors that led to the English Civil Wars. And I'm telling you all this because, again, I want you to appreciate the violence and just craziness that these Puritans are coming out of. And you've got these local Congregationalist movements who are just doing whatever they want. And they kind of divide into three camps: the Separatists, the Puritans, and the Reformers. The Separatists wanted to separate from the Church of England and become Congregationalist. The Reformers wanted to stay within the Anglican Church and sort of purify it from within. But the term Puritan is this larger umbrella term for both Separatists and Reformers. And so what are the characteristics of the Puritans? Well, they sought to purify Christianity as they saw it, from the wickedness and the dirtiness that they saw especially in Catholicism, but also in Anglicanism as well. I mean, the root word of Puritan is pure, right? They were more often separatists because they didn't think the Church of England could be reformed, and they saw themselves in very clear, powerful ways. They saw themselves as the true Christians. They thought they were returning Christianity to its primitive, original roots, like the time of Jesus. They saw themselves as removing power and money and hierarchy from religion, like let's break from the big churches and become our own local, intimate community of believers. They talk about themselves as if they're the chosen people, and you're going to definitely see this in the literature. They're the chosen people. God loves them best. They think they're the return of Israel to earth, or they're the spiritual descendants of Israel. And so for them, fleeing the European continent for the New World was like, they saw themselves as like the Israelites, right? This new exodus from evil. They'd often talk about English kings and queens as if they're, evil, wicked Pharaoh from the Bible. These people were really full of themselves, and you're going to get a sense of that. They really believe that they were God's chosen people and that they're fleeing from this dying, violent, ugly Europe to this new place. And so, because they did not align themselves with the Anglican Church, they were persecuted, right? Because they were legally required to attend the Church of England as citizens of England. And so this led to a crisis of conscience for many of them, and they fled, right? The most notable group for American school children is the Plymouth group. These are the so-called Pilgrims. These are so-called Pilgrims, which they weren't, and I'm going to talk about that in a moment. And kind of an interesting path that they went through. They fled to Holland, and then when Catholic Spain began to look like they were going to attack and invade Holland, that's when they fled to New England. And once again, you'll see in the literature, they see this all in very cosmic, good versus evil terms, or very biblical terms. Again, the flight of the Israelites and things like that. And so this has some implications for the literature that we're going to read in this unit. And in this unit, we're going to focus on rhetoric and style. And rhetoric is a fancy word for just the kind of art and science of how arguments are made. And so they saw everything in these good versus evil terms. You're going to see a lot of biblical allusions. A lot of the writing is there to kind of justify their sacred mission to themselves and members of their community who maybe had doubts, as well as to the people back home in England and on the European continent. You're going to see in their writing just the primacy of God in all things, and really no matter how mundane. I mean, I'm exaggerating here, but some of the literature gets to the point of, oh, I broke my pencil, it's God's will, or, it's God's will that we're having cheeseburgers for lunch today. I mean, they really talked and thought in those terms that everything is this cosmic good versus evil, Jesus versus Satan sort of thing, even, whether or not we have cheeseburgers for lunch. The writing tends to be characterized by simplicity and a very honest style, sometimes known as the Puritan plain style. But they will use a lot of imagery, especially imagery of heaven and hell. And we're going to see that in Jonathan Edwards's speech. And sometimes the writing can feel very stern and very exhortatory in its tones because after all, a lot of it was written by preachers who are trying to get people to believe and do things. And so, that's a lot of what we're going to see in the Puritan literature that we read. We're also going to consider this as colonial literature, right? Because these people were colonists. They weren't pilgrims, right? That term that we teach American school children when they make the little turkey out of your hand and the little paper hats, these people were not pilgrims, right? Pilgrims go somewhere and then they go back home. And you can ask your Native American friends. These people did not go back home, right? They stayed. They were colonizers. So they stayed and they built lives for themselves because that's what colonizers do. And some colonizers work for the benefit of the mother country as well. And the Puritans did benefit England through their actions, although that wasn't their first priority. So, this is also a literature of colonization. And part of this comes out of the idealizations that Europeans had towards America. A lot of Europeans at this time period, weren't very educated. They kind of didn't know where the New World was. It was just on the other side of the water over there. And they would often spin these very fanciful ideas about what America was. And this fits right into our course theme of what does it mean to be an American. Very often, even nowadays, we Americans idealize our country as seeing it as being very special and unique among the whole world. I mean, I can't tell you how many people I've met from around the world who will say that as like, you Americans think you're special and you think your place is something special. And who knows, maybe it is. I certainly like it. But, at the time, these Europeans have all these idealizations, right? They see America as a kind of Garden of Eden, a perfect place over there. Sometimes they saw it as a place of the devil. And we're going to see that when we get to the crucible in our next unit, that very often the forest and the place out in the wilderness, that's where the devil lives. And the city where the churches are, that's, where the Christians are, and that's where God is. Often too, these Europeans saw this whole mission, this whole colonization as an opportunity to spread Christianity because they believe they're saving people's souls, particularly the Native Americans, right? We've got to go over there and, teach them about God and get them baptized so they don't go to hell. I mean, they often thought they were doing a good thing for other people. Some of them, of course, saw this as an opportunity to get land and wealth because by this time in Europe, all land is controlled by royal and noble families. There's very little opportunity for ambitious young men to get land. But over there on the other side of the water, there's all this land, right? And they saw it often as an empty land, a place for them to create a new world. We still use that term sometimes, or some kind of utopia or perfect society. I mean, America was really like this blank piece of paper that the European mind wanted to draw its perfect fantasy on. And this was built on this myth of the empty land, right? Because for the Europeans, permanent building and farming was how land was occupied or used. And for the most part, the Native Americans, especially along the eastern coast, they didn't do these things. I mean, limited farming, but not a whole lot of big, large-scale building. And so to the European mind, hey, it's empty land. And this was helped along, too, by devastating epidemics like smallpox and chickenpox and others that really were emptying the land. I mean, you get some areas in New England where these diseases had like a 60, 70% mortality rate. I mean, 60, 70%. That's like in your classroom of 30 students, that's like 18 or 21 of them dying in a matter of months. So, I mean, to a degree, the Europeans came upon empty land, and they also saw themselves as being civilized. And of course, Native Americans to them were savage, and they weren't using the land as it should be used. And so, this spurred along, too, this idealization of America. One of the first major climaxes of these tensions between Native Americans and Puritans was King Philip's War, in which in 1675, the Wampanoag leader Metacomet, who was known as King Philip to the Europeans, led attacks against settlements in New England. And this was prompted by massive immigrations, up to like 20,000 Europeans moving into New England in a very short period of time. agreements and treaties were dishonored and often ignored. And then, of course, the introduction of diseases. You can see why the Native Americans were obviously very angry, and they saw the Europeans as an invading army. And conducted this war for something like 3 years, and it was 2 years. It was a very bloody and brutal war. I mean, almost every single major settlement in around Massachusetts was hit. Up to 10% loss of fighting men on the European side, and the Europeans, in their very Puritan way of looking at things, they saw this as evidence of Native American savagery, and they very often saw it in cosmic terms. When you read some of the primary sources from this time period, the Indians are the agents of the devil, the Europeans are the white, righteous, sons of Israel and the chosen seed. And, in some ways, it was a very apocalyptic time for these European colonizers. They saw this as a showdown between good and evil. And so it's that kind of Manichaeism look at the universe, right? And I've said this a lot, right? But to the European mind, everything at this time period is good versus evil. It's us versus them. We're the chosen people. And so anybody who's against us is obviously with the devil. And one of the major forms of literature that we're going to study in this unit is the captivity narrative. And these come out of things like King Philip's War and just general abductions as well. This is a very popular genre during this time period, kind of like crime shows are in our day and age, that we like to tune in and watch this violence and all this craziness. These captivity narratives were often about people who were kidnapped and held hostage by Indians. They're written in very juicy and vivid and sometimes sentimental and emotional language in which, the poor, beautiful woman who's captured by these evil, dark savages. I mean, the language can be very, very strong. It served in many ways as a propaganda for the European cause. It justified the fact that they were good and the Indians were evil as they saw it. And like I said, it's kind of the juicy, dirty reality TV of the colonial period. And we're going to read a selection from Mary Rowlandson's captivity narrative just so you can get a sense of that. This was also the time period that gave birth to African American literature. Pretty much as long as there's been American literature, there's been African American literature. As early as 1619 is the most common date you'll see for the arrival of the first slaves at Virginia colony. And right off the bat, you get Africans starting to write their stories. Now, Olaudah Equiano's interesting narrative of the life of Olaudah Equiano is a powerful example of an early slave narrative. Now, that one wasn't written until the middle 1700s, but it's an example of these kinds of narratives that are often written in very simple and direct, honest styles to try to let the facts speak for themselves. And Africans who wrote slave narratives were very conscious of, if we just tell the truth, slavery is going to end, because, it just is as awful as everybody, as we now think of it. We're also going to look at the beginning of African American literature with Phyllis Wheatley, who was an African American poet who lived in the North, and she was a slave, but very highly educated, especially in neoclassical poetics and structure. Uses a lot of classical allusions to ancient Greece and Rome, and she's an interesting figure. I mean, she's a great poet. And she was very conscious of, and white abolitionists who were trying to stop slavery were very conscious of the fact that here's this African slave that, look at this awesome education she's had, and now look what an amazing writer she is. And so she was also, like Olaudah Equiano, a major figure in showing that Africans were, in fact, fully human and could be educated and could be just as highly achieving and highly skilled as Europeans. It may seem silly for us to think about that now, but these people are living at a time period in which not everyone even believed that Africans were human. So, important African American writers here showed, what we now take for granted. Like I said, I feel like an idiot even saying that, but that was the worldview at this time period. And so a couple final thoughts here and some thematic connections that are going to run throughout this unit. First of all, I don't want you to make the same mistake the Puritans did. I think sometimes American students in our day and age just say, okay, these people were all racists and they were violent colonizers and they just wanted to take advantage of Indians and steal things and steal land. And, you know, they did all those things. I mean, they were racists and they were colonizers and they were invaders. But at the same time, they're coming at a very complex time in world history in which everybody's scrambling for the new world. Everybody's worldview has been shaken to the core. I mean, you think about just the kind of apocalyptic view that these people had of history and of themselves. I mean, they were running away and they were running scared for their lives. And so, you know, we shouldn't give the Puritans a free pass, but we also shouldn't just decide that they're white devils and Satan and write them off. They were complicated people living in a complicated world. As well for the Native Americans and African Americans who are coming up against a very highly armed, highly organized civilization with writing and ships and farming and iron and, you know, guns. And so life for Native Americans and African Americans was also very complicated as well. And, you know, these people interacted, sometimes friends, sometimes enemies, always neighbors. You know, so let's not simplify this and view the Puritans as just the devil on earth. And as you think about the Puritans, I want you to think about the driving question for the course, right? What does it mean to be an American? And the religious roots, particularly the Christian roots of this nation, are going to be very evident. And although we consider ourselves a secular democracy, when was the last time you went to school on Christmas? Right? So obviously Christianity is still very much a part of the American tradition and something we need to consider. I don't care if you're Christian or not. I'm certainly not trying to get you baptized. If you're not, that's not my business. But you do need to consider the religious roots of this nation, or else you don't understand American history. And so consider all that, the race, the gender, the nationality, the nationhood, the religion. It's all central to this course, and it's all here in this unit on the Puritans and the colonists. Thanks for watching.